I'm Gary Nickerson,
And I'm Quinn Taggart.
and this is Outside My Window. Our guest this week is Kristen Fowler. Now, Kristen has lived in Yarmouth her entire life, save a 4 year stint to attend Acadia University, where she studied history and English. She's been working with Mythic Games and Hobbies for about 4 years, first as a volunteer, and then later as the manager of the business. By her own admission, part of the nerd community, she's been able to thrive as a professional miniature painter, a Pokemon trading card game collector, and, more importantly, an active part of a local and very lively board game community. Kristen, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here.
So, going back a few years, how were you always interested in games, board games, and all of that? Did you get that from your parents, and how did it evolve to the stage of involvement that you're in now?
Board games and I have a very weird history in that there isn't a ton of history that I have with it. Growing up, I was kind of under this misconception that the only board games that existed were Monopoly and Yahtzee and the standard ones that everybody knows about. And you get bored of those very quickly. I also began to become a chronic cheater when it came to Monopoly, so people wouldn't play with me, and it was a whole big thing. So I had to keep it interesting. But
Were you
it
printing
took
your own money? Was that the thing or what?
the key is to be the banker.
It's funny how that works. Hmm.
Absolutely. So I kind of left the board games behind. I didn't come from a family where board games were a big thing. We would have the occasional dominoes evening, and that was always fun. It was a bonding thing, but it wasn't really what I associate now as a board game night. Even at university, I didn't really go near board games. It wasn't my thing because I thought people were still playing kind of the Hasbro, the Parker Brothers games. Then when I got out of university and came back to Yarmouth, about 5 years after I had settled back down, I went to the local game store that had just opened up, and they invited me to a board game night. And I was like, well, can't hurt. So I went, and my mind was blown because I couldn't believe how far board games had come. These guys, they introduced me to it was a whole new world. It was fantastic.
So, from your childhood, did you partake in any, strategic kind of games like chess or checkers or that kind of thing? Has that helped you in your current gaming?
So when I was younger, actually elementary school, when I was in grade 5 and 6, there was a chess club. So I was part of the chess club and I took to it very well. I've always liked those strategic games. I did a lot of problem solving puzzles, that kind of thing when I was a kid. So that appealed to me. Um, the exposure wasn't there though. There wasn't a ton of places you go to now kind of in the same community that you would revisit. Now you can go to a game store on a night and meet people that are playing all of these fantastic, intricate games. When I was a kid in the 90s, everybody had a closet with a bunch of board games shoved into it. Um, God forbid you pull out Mousetrap and spend 45 minutes only to realize you're missing a piece and you can't play anything on it. Um, so I didn't come from a background of board games. And that's kind of, I look back on it now and say, yeah, there was no early association with it. Even in classrooms, if we had time to kill, sometimes we'd get card games in. Um, but that's really where it stopped.
So then once you're out of university and you're settled back in and you go into the game store and you're exposed to all this, what sorts of types of board games are we talking about?
So my first intro to modern day board games is going to sound extremely cliche, but it was actually Settlers of Catan. That was the first board game I sat down in front of. There were four other people playing, and I thought, wow, this is not like any other board game I've ever played. This is incredible. I'm loving the strategy, the bluffing, the just kind of going in with an idea and having to shift halfway through because the player before you totally put in an upset and you can no longer do what you were intending to do. And then I kind of did my own research, and every board game night I would go to, there'd be new games. So then I was introduced to Pandemic and Betrayal on House of the Hill, all of the what I would consider staples of modern day board game collections. So it's been a fantastic ride because you never know what you're going to come up with now, um, based on sort of the changing evolution of how board games have kind of come to be the forefront of general play.
So Gary and I are of an age, we won't say what, but we're of an age where I guess Clue and Yahtzee and Monopoly would have been our staples if we had game night.
Mhm.
But then, as I went into the 80s, Dungeons and Dragons was the thing. And then, a bit of controversy on that too, but
Absolutely.
that's a whole other show. But but my exposure to board games at that point in time were a lot of World War II recreations of land battles, whether it's Panzer tanks or whatever. And those things took time to run through the whole campaigns. Is it like that now, or is it like a real shorter hit and miss kind of deal?
It honestly depends because actually you're right on the money when you say something like a military inspired board games. And actually, if it wasn't for ancient militaries, board games might not have shaped out the way we experience them now. But I can go into that a little bit later. Um, the duration of a board game, generally, you're looking at a 2 hour time period. A lot of them now are right on the box. It says 40 to 90 minutes. It all depends on how you play, how lucky you get. But absolutely, there still are games out there that they have communities built around these longer game systems. So one of the most popular game systems right now is done by Games Workshop. It's called Warhammer 40K. You can It's done at a tabletop with miniatures, and it's all dice based and measurement based. So you could be looking at a 5 to 6 hour game. We've had games in the shop that have gone for 12 hours. We usually do a large scale game on New Year's Eve that everybody just brings everything they've got and they just have fun. Those games become more of a social event rather than a sitting down to play for the love of the game. That being said, there are some massive scale games out there that are meant to recreate World War II down to some of the smallest details. And those games, they can last months at a time. Unfortunately, the name of it escapes me right now, but uh, a quick Google search will pull up some of these some of these massive games, and you start out all historically accurate, and then as you make decisions, whether you're on the home front, on the Western theater, the Pacific, that will affect the entire game board. And this isn't a normal tabletop game board. We're looking at somebody has put this on a wall that is going to just have the scope of the world broken down into its zones. It's absolutely fascinating. It's not for the faint of heart because these games they can be more of a test of endurance than a test of skill sometimes. But board games as we know them now, they tend to be shorter periods of time, 60 to 90 minutes. Say for if we're talking about something like you mentioned D&D, that's a campaign game. So that means you do it. Uh, you go over to a buddy's house, you sit down at the table, you play a session, you end the session, you resume the session at a later time. So that's a little more uh, easier to bite off than something like these larger scale games.
Now you mentioned miniature painting. I mean, again, back in my day, at the risk of sounding old, um, they were pewter or lead oriented, anyways.
Yep,
And painting them was a bit of a challenge. The detail was really, really nice. Some of them could be pretty shitty, but I mean, for the most part, if you bought the good ones, they were really, really nice. But they're all plastic or composite now, aren't they?
absolutely. Miniature painting and sculpting has become an art unto itself. The stuff that's being produced now, it's it's beautiful. They're their own works of art. I still have some some of those, like you were mentioning, the dreaded lead ones. I keep those in a little lock box because I don't want to handle the lead any more than I have to. Um, we've seen such an evolution just in miniature painting. Even with the paints themselves, most guys and gals, they would use an oil-based paint. Now we've moved on to a lot of water-based, and with that water-based, it's less fumes, it's non-toxic, and you can get just as good, if not better, results from these new paints than you could previously. Plus, the plastic allows a lot more detail. We're finding a lot more personality in models now than we ever did. And with the way production is now, board games, some people buy a board game based on the sculpts of the miniatures. We're no longer using the little, we call them meeples. So either they were either made of wood or they were some abstract plastic shape like you would see in Story. Um, Now, a lot of the appeal of board games for some people is the fact that miniatures are included. You get to paint those miniatures, you get to give them their own personality, and then you have the added satisfaction of being able to see them play it on a game board.
Interesting, interesting. And again, I really enjoyed doing the painting, which was, part and parcel for me. So you mentioned, you know, different types of the games and so on. Is there only a few manufacturers or publishers of these, or is that just as broad as everything else?
It's sometimes broader. So, if we look at the history of board games in general, um, we're going way, way back. Um, the first board game that we've really been able to peg down, it was called the Royal Game of Ur. It was discovered in Iraq. It's over 4,600 years ago. That was just kind of, we found it and we're like, okay. So board games have been kind of with human history for a very long time. We know that ancient Egypt was the first place that we really saw kind of board gaming taking its shape. Um, and it was kind of a, like it was very much tied into royalty. Even when it comes to the ancient Romans and the Greeks, it was very much a pastime of higher society. But then when the Romans come around, that's when we see this big kind of uptick in games. So we're seeing checkers and chess and dominoes. Actually, tic tac toe came out of that. Nine men's Morris came out of that as well. Roman soldiers were known to play board games quite frequently because, I mean, they're on these long treks. You get bored, you need to kill time. So we saw the evolution of small pocket sized games that people could carry around. And sometimes these games just ended up being dice, but games were created around it. Um, so then we started moving into um, just kind of the revolution of board games over time. It took a very long time for us to really see anything new. When the Industrial Revolution happened, we get better printing, better production, better distribution. Um, and war inspired military strategy games have been with us for a very long time. Actually, one of the first ones was, excuse my Latin pronunciation, it's not up to snuff, but it was called, if I'm not mistaken, Ludos Latriculatorium, and it was a two-player strategy game that was actually referenced in the works of Homer. So Homer of the Odyssey and the Iliad fame, not of the donut fame. Um, So most of these games were limited. We have limited sources on them, but we can reconstruct kind of basic rules, and we knew that it was tied into military strategy because everybody's been always fascinated by military strategy. Like 700 AD, we saw the first Mancala come in. People play that even now. But where we really start to see this awesome shift in games, there were two revolutions as far as I'm concerned, and this is the first one, and the second one's Kickstarter, which I'll get to. Um, so in 1903, a woman named Lizzie Maggie patented a game called Landlord's Game. Now, picture this. It's a square board with different locations that you'll land on. You are able to purchase these locations. You are able to upgrade these locations. And the goal is to outbuy everybody else on the board.
Well,
So
that
what does
sounds
that
familiar.
Yeah, very
exactly?
familiar. Hmm.
Exactly. And in the 30s, Parker Brothers bought her patent, and she sold that patent for $500.
Oh Lord.
So
Oh dear.
Yeah.
yes, um, and
She
I'll
should have
say
asked for a percentage.
Yeah, yeah, really.
she should have. Hindsight is very much 2020 in this
Absolutely.
respect. So yeah, she sold it for $500, but Parker Brothers took this, changed it into Monopoly, and then suddenly there was this huge demand. So from that, we saw Risk, we saw Sorry, we saw Chutes and Ladders, we saw Battleship, and we saw Trivial Pursuit. So this was this whole new genre of thing that was out there for public consumption. Of course, in the 80s, public consumption was going up and up. In the 90s, it was highly commercialized. And then in 95, what we got was the first game that was created in Europe to see international success. And that game was Settlers of Catan. And most folks listening have either seen a game being played, have played the game themselves, or have at least seen it on shelves somewhere. It's one of the best-selling games. Everybody knows it. There's tons of expansions. It's been translated into hundreds of different languages, and it was a new revolution. And then along came Kickstarter, and Kickstarter was the ultimate game changer. So crowdfunding in its infancy, we saw a lot of benefits for sick folks or people that had these new patents they wanted to push through. And then we started to see board game creators. Um, this meant that anybody that had a board game idea could see that realized if they could pitch it. But they weren't pitching it to a board of suits. They were pitching it to the people that were going to buy it directly. So that's when we see this absolute boom of new games. We see new tabletop games, new legacy games, new real-time strategy games like Exit Rooms in a Box. One of the best-selling of all time has been Gloomhaven. And if you could compare it to anything, compare it to if you could crush Risk and D&D into one box, you get Gloomhaven. Suddenly, if there was something you were interested in, you could get it in a board game. No problem. If it was dinosaurs, if it was World War II Soviet tanks, if it was the economy of Constantinople, you can find a board game on it. And it's fantastic. It's given so many people a renewed sense of interest in board games themselves.
Kristen, I want to ask you about how technology um, and social changes has affected the way games are presented to people. We talked earlier about sitting around with our friends back in the day and playing Monopoly. It was one of my favorite games because you know it was fake money, but it seemed like real money at the time. And you could play. Remember, you could play a short game or the long game, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we always play. I always wanted to play the long game until my parents put an end to it because I'd get a little. If I started to lose, I'd get a little, cranky, and then we were kicked outside, rain or not. And you
We're all
probably know, as you probably yeah, as you probably know, Kristen, the Queen Elizabeth banned the playing of Monopoly at any at any gathering of the royal family, because apparently some of them, including Prince Philip, got, they get very nasty. It was, of course, they were very competitive, and apparently one day she said no more and banned the playing of Monopoly. Anyway, so can you talk how, first of all, technology has changed things from where, family or friends would sit around that kitchen table with that board game to now, I think of one of my grandsons who likes to play Minecraft. So, and he'll, go online and play with other people, maybe in another province or another country. So, can you talk to how all that has changed what we used to think is the, common board game?
absolutely. So technology was something that's kind of always gone hand in hand with board games, even if you don't necessarily jump right to sort of the Minecraft, the Roblox, the stuff that kids are more familiar with. Um, Batteries in games have been large. Um, of course, it was those notorious batteries not included. Games would come with electronic timers, that kind of thing. Um, and with new technology, we'd see the evolution of board games kind of fit to suit that. Um, Now there is a big online community. Um, and I should say this first, most board gamers prefer to play in person. There's a certain strategy that comes with board games, and you need to look your opponent in the eye sometimes, and you need to beg them not to make the move they're about to make. And there's a lot of politics around the board game table. There's alliances that are formed and then immediately crushed, and you don't get that same interaction online. Um, but there are board games out now that your phone is an integral part of it. Sometimes your phone will provide the background noise to the game. Um, there is one that we play often. It's called Fuse, and uh, um, you have to kill, depending on how many people you have, a certain number of bombs. You've got to defuse a certain number. And there's a timer on your phone through an app that you can get. But while that timer's counting down, the main character from the story that you're playing through is telling you to hurry up. And she's got quite the witty dialogue that you hate at the end because you're tired of hearing her tell you that you're failing at your job and you're under pressure to defuse these bombs. So that's a good way where technology has kind of come into play. Gloomhaven, like I was explaining, the setup for that game can be exceptionally long, but the creators of it have also licensed out an app which allows easier setup, and everything is digitalized except for your player board. So you play on the physical board when you have all of this information kind of stored in your phone. It's got a random dice roller, and it's an aid to the game. And we've also seen sort of with the boom of apps on phones, a lot of these apps kind of mirror a basic board game. So actually last year, call it bad timing or not, we got Plague Inc. And it was formally, well, it still is, I shouldn't say formally, an app on your phone where you play as a virus, and your goal is to infect the world faster than everybody else's. Like I said, kind of bad timing, but it's a good game. So that game was so successful on mobile that they produced a board game. And the board game plays exceptionally well. It's a fantastic game. and we wouldn't have it if it hadn't been uh, effectively a video game first. And we're seeing that a lot more too, where video game IPs are lending their characters, their worlds to the board game world. Um, and we saw last year with the pandemic and not being able to gather in groups, the online community became integral to board games. It was kind of like so people may still do this. I hope they do because I love the idea. Playing chess with somebody overseas, and you both have a board set up, and you write down your first move, and you mail it overseas, and then a couple weeks later, a letter comes back to you with their move, and you move the chessboard accordingly. So with the age of internet, we don't have to wait that 2 weeks for a letter to come in the mail, and you can play online. Tabletop simulators are basically what we refer to them as, and I think there's actually a website that is called Tabletop Simulator where you're able to play against people online. It's it's kept board games going, especially when obviously gatherings were frowned upon. We weren't able to get in groups. We could at least still play some of our favorite games online.
I know from chess perspective, a lot of that's moved online. I play online with a couple of guys. One I went to school with actually, and he's now living in Toronto. And him and I just recently reconnected and continue to play. And another gentleman that I play with a lot over in England. And but with the timing, and the time
Hmm.
difference, it's
Yeah.
usually a couple of days before he makes his moves, and then I'll make mine, and we'll banter back and forth. So essentially, it's like mail chess, and I've done that in the past, and you're doing it with an app now. It's basically the same thing, so it's all good. But I don't have to set up a board or worry about the cat knocking over the pieces or anything
Yes.
along that line. It's in my phone. If the cat knocks the phone over, I'll still have my board. But are there board games that run in a similar vein? Like, will they do male moves?
It's not something I've ever kind of really explored. Um, but what I've found is where there's a will, there's a way. People are always looking for creative ways to play board games. It's it's kind of just it's almost a badge of honor to say you've played this game in such a way that maybe other people haven't experienced that game before. So it wouldn't surprise me if there are those scenarios, but the ones I'm more acquainted with would be um, especially popping onto Discord. That's a big system now that people use for D&D. Even now, where we are allowed to gather in certain size groups, there are still campaigns running through online portals because some people just like playing in the comfort of their own home.
There is a certain level of anonymity to these online games, Kristen, isn't there? You can adopt usernames or game names, or some people more comfortable in that kind of a format in playing those games.
We see that a lot more in especially like the first person shooters, the team games. So we're looking at the Call of Duties, the Overwatch, um, like we mentioned, Minecraft, Roblox, those kind of things. That's certainly an appeal for a lot of people. Board games, yes, there are some where you will have a username, so you'll never play against the same person twice. The odds of you running into the person you've played on the street is pretty much zil. Um, that being said, if you're on something like Discord, usually you've created that group and it's personal invite only. So I could have a group of like five of my closest friends pop into this group, and it's a closed group. Nobody else can get into it. We all know who each other are, and it's it's less it's more personal in that way. Um, that being said, I've got friends that they've met some of their best friends from playing online anonymously, and then somebody mentioned something, and like, oh wait, you're in Nova Scotia? Where are you? It's like, oh, I'm in Yarmouth. Oh, I'm in Bridgewater. Oh, that's cool. What are the odds? And then they meet up, and it's great. Obviously, there are some risks with that, and I never suggest anybody meet anybody online without taking the proper channels. But it does create this online community. It just as much as it does create an in-person community, and that's kind of the versatility of board games and just games in general, honestly. Because when we talk board games, you kind of put yourself into a box in that a board game is something that's a little more compact. D&D, for example, is a role-playing game, or an RPG, as most people refer to it. Warhammer 40K that I mentioned before, that is a miniature tabletop board game. So tabletop games are a little bit different again. And then you have your kind of standard board games, what everybody would classify, from Monopoly all the way to Gloomhaven into Pandemic and all those other fantastic games.
At the risk of hitting a touchy topic, but are you seeing with the evolution of board games and gaming overall a bit of a continuation of some gender bias as well as age bias?
It's it's an interesting question. Myself, I've been exceptionally lucky because I'm good at board games. So if somebody's going to
Yeah, but
pick
that
on
could
me,
cause some friction, as well, right?
I'm lucky again. I grew up in the '90s. I was part of the tech boom. I kind of got used to this very early on. I'm like, okay, I'm a girl in a not female dominated space, so I have to expect some things. But for the most part, I could count on one hand the problems I've had with somebody that's like, oh, this isn't a game for girls, or oh, just write her off. She's not going to affect the game. In person with the game community in Yarmouth, I've absolutely never had that problem. We're also finding more representation in board games, whether it's a like a gender or a um, ethnicity. There's a lot more representation. It's just not a bunch of white guys around a table anymore playing. And the characters you play are very diverse. There's a lot more representation in that regard as well. And for the most part, the board game community is totally open to it, because at the end of the day, we just want your game to be very good. We we like seeing that representation. We like seeing kind of the progressive um, lines that board games are going into. As a female gamer, I've not experienced it on the level that I know, unfortunately, some people have. And I hate that for my community, because I love this community, but I can't stand up for somebody that's pitching a fit because they're playing against somebody that is not their race or not their gender. It's a very low form of person that will do that, and they learn quite quickly that they're not welcome in that community. And like I said, with the one that we have here in Yarmouth, it's a great group. It's open to everybody. We've got just no two people are the same. And that's always interesting, because you have these people coming in with different perspectives, and everybody will play the same board game differently. And that to me is the value of it, because you start to see how somebody else is thinking, and you kind of, you work with that and you figure it out. And like, what's cooler than that? It's like a mini social experiment, for lack of a better term.
So flipping that around a little bit. Oh, I'm not going to play board games. That's a nerd thing, or that's a geeky thing. But that's not true either.
I've always used the term nerd and geek as a term of endearment. To me, if somebody gets abrasive and says, I'm not a nerd, I look at them and say, so you are not interested in anything. I've got members of my family that are deeply, deeply into sports. Myself, I'm a Patriots fan. I watch my Pats when they play. Um, but they're what you would call the sports fanatics. To me, they are a sports nerd. That's
Yeah,
that's
but
what
you,
it is.
oh,
If you
heaven
can look
forbid
me
you
in the
call
eye
him.
and rattle off,
Yeah,
sorry.
heaven forbid you call the sports guy a nerd like that. That's almost like polar opposites, right? And the reason I brought that up is because I mean, yeah, again, showing my age a bit, back in my younger years, being a geek and or a nerd was, put you into a certain category of people. But one thing I did find is that the geeks and the nerds stuck together,
Yes.
and there was no lines of divisiveness when it came to that. It was a very accepting community.
Oh, absolutely. And now with the age that we're in, we've seen a lot more crossover. So now it's exceptionally cool to play video games. When I was younger, so we're talking late 90s, early 2000s, it it wasn't it wasn't something you did with friends very often. It wasn't something you advertised. But now all of the all of what you would classify now as like the popular folk, that's kind of one of the key things. And my board game group has been made up of um, sort of college level athletes. I have military, active, and veteran. I've got sort of what you would traditionally label as the not nerds, not the geeks. So what we would call like the jocks. Um, they finally realized that it's way more fun to join the nerds than it is to shove them in a locker, basically.
Yeah, we saw that in Revenge of the Nerds, a classic movie I might recommend. Um,
Absolutely,
the
solid
second, the
movie.
second one, not so much, but the first one
Yeah,
was good.
no, we don't pretend that. We'll pretend that one doesn't
Yeah,
exist.
that doesn't exist.
So, if Kristen, if folks want to learn more, this has been so interesting. I've learned so much just in this short time, and you've certainly piqued my interest because, like I say, I'm old. I go back to you know playing Beat the Clock. I don't know if you remember that, or that goes
Yeah,
Remember
yeah,
the, I remember the
a
TV
few
show.
years. That's right. So, if somebody's listening and they want to learn more, they want to be perhaps become part of this local game community. How can they do that, Kristen?
oh, well, there's tons of ways. For people that are more comfortable playing online, there's absolutely a ton of online resources. If you're interested in learning the history more, just have a chat with me any day. I'm full of. I had to kind of rein myself in, but there's such a fascinating human history tied into games, and that games are a major part of human history. But if people want to kind of get dice in their hands and look and see what's going to appeal to them, we play board games every Saturday night at Mythic Games and Hobbies downtown. We're located in the yellow building between Sip and Jones Gym. Um, it's kind of a pop in, see what you like. We've got a ton of board games on hand that people can actually rent out and play. Um, I'm always there for people to touch base with if they have any questions. We also sell a myriad of games in the store, and there's usually something for everybody. Um, the most popular ones right now, actually, which I didn't even touch on, were the real time games. So if you've ever done an exit room or an escape room, I should say, they now make those in a box. So you get you and three of your closest friends that you don't mind yelling at for about 40 minutes. Um, and you have to solve all of the riddles to solve the story. And it plays exactly like an exit room would or an escape room. They're they're a lot more hands on, and I find that people that don't generally like board games, they like these exit games.
So with Christmas coming and bearing in mind, the air date on this is going to be a little leaning more towards Christmas than it was Halloween, but still, with Christmas coming up, what would people like to see under their tree?
It really comes down to the personality. When somebody comes in and asks me, "Hey, I have a friend. They don't play a ton of games, but here's what they like," I try to cater it towards that. 9 times out of 10, I get the friend that comes in and say, "Well, they've played Catan and they've played Pandemic. What can you recommend me?" So I'll kind of go off of those interests. But in my experience, things like the exit games make an excellent gift. They generally retail for about $20. They are a one-time use game, but they fit beautifully in a stocking. There are also larger scale games. Because you can't talk about board games without talking about the price of board games. The starting value can be $10. Um, you can get a solid little game for $10. The bulk of board games fall between $50 and $80, and then you get the far end of it, which, especially if you start going onto Kickstarter, doing those kind of things, you're looking at $500 to $600 for all-in packages, which is everything that board game is ever going to have right to your door. But I should caution people, and I hate saying it, but shopping early is going to be your best friend, because the board game industry has been heavily impacted by the shipping container crisis that we're facing worldwide right now. Kickstarters have been delayed 6 to 12 months. My personal stock is exceptionally difficult to get in. Reorders are very hard. If you see it on the shelf today, it's not a bad idea to grab it. And that's not me kind of pushing people and punching them in the
No,
jaw.
it's just good
Here,
advice.
buy it. It's the grim reality that we are going to be facing a ton of shortages, especially in the hobby field. We've already seen it with miniature paints and terrain building supplies. And unfortunately, the trickle-down effect is that so many things are backed up that board games that are coming fresh off the press are sitting in the Atlantic and the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, and they're just kind of chilling when we desperately need them here.
Yeah, I saw in the news that there was like 200,000 containers offshore California right now waiting to be offloaded.
Yep, and that's just California.
Yeah, exactly. That's only one port.
Yes, exactly. Mind you, it's one of the larger ones, but that kind of gives you a visual of those shipping containers. They hold a lot of product, and that's product that's not getting to distributors, which in turn is not getting to their stores like mine, which is a local game store. They're just as thoroughly not getting to the Targets and the Walmarts and all of our bigger box stores as well.
That's right.
So it's definitely changing a lot for people. Online has been kind of our best friend over the last year, and right now that supplies is drying up as well. So we're kind of in the great unknown. Like there's this giant precipice that we're about to face that is the holiday season, with kind of, it's not a great overturn of stock.
So if you see it, buy it.
That is the takeaway, especially when it comes to board games, because board games, if the pandemic did nothing else for last year, it taught people the value of having pastime in a house with 4 people.
Yes, indeed.
Kristen, you have made this conversation interesting, educational, and a whole lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for having me. I was thrilled that I was asked. I appreciate it.
I'm Gary Nickerson.
And I'm Quinn Taggart.
And this has been Outside My Window.